ever felt like someone was watching you?
Bryn stood in front of her mirror, practicing her smile. It had to be just right, not too wide, not too forced. She tried different versions, tilting her head slightly, changing the angle of her lips. Every morning started like this, a ritual that felt necessary, even if no one else seemed to care. She cleared her throat and repeated her greeting softly. "Good morning. Hope you're doing well today." She adjusted the inflection, made her voice a little warmer. It still sounded off, but it would have to do. Smoothing down her dress, she exhaled slowly, then turned away from the mirror and headed downstairs. As soon as she stepped outside, she froze. A perfect, circular patch of scorched grass marred the otherwise green lawn in front of her house. The edges were sharp, as if something had pressed down and burned itself into the ground. Bryn stared at it for a moment, then shook her head and forced herself to move. It was probably just some weird prank. Or maybe lightning had struck in the night. She didn't want to waste time thinking about it. Sliding into her car, she took a deep breath and adjusted the rearview mirror. Today would be different. Today, she'd try harder. She turned the key, the engine groaned to life, and she set off toward town. The early morning sun bathed the road in golden light as Bryn drove past familiar houses, each one carrying memories she preferred not to dwell on. A figure stood in the distance near his mailbox, her neighbor, Mr. Denton. Bryn straightened in her seat and rolled down her window as she passed. "Good morning, Mr. Denton," she called out, her practiced greeting delivered with enthusiasm. Mr. Denton barely spared her a glance before turning his back to her, muttering something under his breath. Bryn swallowed the disappointment that tried to creep in. She'd expected that, hadn't she? Still, it didn't stop the dull ache from settling in her chest. She rolled up the window and kept driving, eyes fixed on the road. She pulled up at the town mailbox, slipping her letter into the slot with careful hands. A letter to Ma, like always. It had become a habit, even though she knew the truth deep down. Bryn continued her route, her next stop a place she never skipped, White Willow Cemetery. The iron gates loomed ahead, rusted and worn with time. She parked outside and stepped in, weaving through the graves until she found the familiar headstone. "Good morning, Mom," she murmured, kneeling beside the grave. She brushed off a few stray leaves, her fingers tracing the engraved name. For a moment, she simply sat there, listening to the distant sound of birds. Then, with a deep breath, she tried again. "Good morning. Hope you're doing well today." She said it as if her mother could hear, as if her words could somehow transcend the barriers of death. But there was no response, only the rustling of the wind. Bryn exhaled, rubbing her arms as she looked around the graveyard. A few people stood scattered across the grounds, but none of them acknowledged her. She debated saying something, maybe trying one more time. Instead, she tightened her lips and remained quiet. Then, she saw them. The Collins. Bryn's stomach twisted as she spotted Ma's parents near another grave. Mrs. Collins stood rigid, her hands clasped in front of her, while Mr. Collins stared down at the headstone with a hard expression. Bryn's heart pounded. She turned away quickly, pretending she hadn't seen them. She knew how this would go. If they noticed her, Mrs. Collins would glare with open disgust. And Mr. Collins, well, he wouldn't look at her at all. She wasn't in the mood to endure their hate today. Bryn hurried back to her car, keeping her head down as she left the cemetery. Back home, she settled into her usual routine. Writing another letter to Ma, her hand moved automatically, the words forming without much thought. "I saw your parents today." She paused, tapping her pen against the table. "I miss you. I wish you were here." She chewed on the inside of her cheek before adding the last part. "I don't think I'll ever be able to forgive myself." The words sat there, heavy and unmoving, like an admission of guilt she wasn't ready to explain. Bryn folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others. She didn't send them. She never did. The rest of her day followed its usual rhythm. She cooked dinner, a romantic setting for one. She played music and danced by herself in the living room, twirling in the dim glow of the chandelier. She followed every step of her routine, each action methodical, predictable, safe. By the time she crawled into bed, the world outside was silent. But then, deep in the night, something changed. A low, inhuman sound echoed in the distance. Then, all at once, every electronic device in her house flickered to life. Bryn woke with a start. The room around her was bathed in the unnatural glow of her alarm clock, television, and bedside lamp, all of them flickering on and off in eerie synchrony. A hum vibrated through the walls, a deep, pulsing noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Still half asleep, she pushed off the covers and swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of what was happening. A power surge? A malfunction? But then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The house fell silent. Bryn exhaled sharply, rubbing her arms to shake off the lingering sense of unease. That was when she heard it. An unmistakable sound from outside. A metallic crash. She tensed, listening. It came again. The unmistakable clang of her trash cans toppling over. Her pulse quickened. A raccoon? A stray dog? But something about it felt different. There had been no scampering feet, no hurried retreat after the crash. Just stillness. Bryn grabbed her phone and tried to turn on the flashlight. Nothing. The screen remained dark. She glanced at her bedroom light switch, flipping it up and down, but the bulb remained unlit. The power was out. She hesitated, then moved toward the window. Peeling back the curtain just an inch, she peered outside. The yard was dimly lit by the moon, the overturned trash cans barely visible near the fence, and something was moving. Bryn's breath caught in her throat. A shape, tall, lanky, and wrong, stood near the cans, shifting slightly as if adjusting to the darkness. The thing made a sound, a rapid clicking noise, sharp and unnatural. It sent a shiver down her spine. Slowly, she backed away from the window. The old wooden floor beneath her creaked. Bryn froze. The clicking outside stopped. Then footsteps, soft but deliberate, moved toward her house. Bryn's mind screamed at her to run, but her body stayed locked in place, paralyzed by the growing certainty that whatever was outside wasn't human. Then she heard it, the sound of the front door creaking open. Bryn sucked in a sharp breath. The door had been locked. She was sure of it. Her legs finally obeyed her, and she turned, creeping toward her closet, but before she could move more than a few steps, she heard something inside the house. The clicking noise was closer now. It was in the hallway. Terror clawed at her throat as she dropped to the floor, slipping under the bed. She pressed a hand over her mouth to keep from breathing too loudly. The wooden boards outside her bedroom door groaned. Then the door creaked open. Bryn bit down on her lip to stop from making a sound. The thing entered the room. Its shadow stretched across the floor, elongated and unnatural. It stood near her window, silent except for a slow, deliberate inhale, like it was tasting the air. Then a noise, low, guttural, and inhuman, rumbled from its throat. Bryn shut her eyes. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears, each second stretching unbearably long. And then, with a sudden movement, the creature let out a deep, bellowing call before leaping out the window. Bryn lay still for a long moment, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Finally, she forced herself to move, scrambling up and shutting the window tight. But the clicking noise hadn't disappeared. It was above her. Her gaze darted to the ceiling, her stomach lurching at the realization. The thing was on the roof. Bryn bolted for the hallway. She had to lock the front door. Her bare feet slapped against the floor as she sprinted down the stairs. Just as she reached the door, a shadow passed over the windows. It was still watching her. She threw the locks into place just as the house came to life again. Every electronic device flickered violently, lights flashing, TV blaring static, the radio screeching a warped, garbled voice. Bryn covered her ears, stumbling backward as the air around her seemed to hum with unnatural energy. She turned toward the phone, grabbing the receiver with trembling hands, but instead of a dial tone, the same piercing screech blasted through the speaker. Then the kitchen erupted into chaos. Cabinets flew open, dishes crashed to the floor, utensils rattled violently inside their drawers. The refrigerator door slammed shut and then swung open again, as if unseen hands were toying with it. Bryn staggered back, gripping the phone so tightly her fingers ached, and then she saw it. The creature stood in the kitchen doorway, tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs too long for its frame. Its skin was slick and gray, its face a twisted mockery of human features. The thing had no eyes, only deep, hollow sockets. It tilted its head, regarding her with a slow, deliberate movement. Bryn's entire body locked up in fear. The creature raised one elongated hand, fingers twitching slightly, and with an unseen force, Bryn was yanked forward. She barely had time to react before she was dragged toward it, feet scraping against the floor as she clawed at the air for something, anything, to hold on to. Her fingers grazed a broken wooden chair leg on the ground. Desperation took over. She snatched it up and, just as she was pulled within inches of the creature's face, drove the sharp end straight into its skull. The alien let out a hideous, ear-splitting shriek. Its body jerked violently, its grip on Bryn loosening. Then it collapsed. Bryn gasped for breath, staggering back as she watched the creature's body twitch once, then go still. Silence filled the house once more. For a long time, she just stood there, shaking, staring at the thing she had killed. Then, as if waking from a trance, she backed away, hands trembling as she reached for the nearest chair and collapsed into it. The night stretched on, and Bryn did not move. She simply sat there, wide-eyed, waiting for the sun to rise. Morning light filtered through the windows, but Bryn barely registered it. She was still sitting in the corner of her kitchen, arms wrapped around her legs, staring at the lifeless alien sprawled on the floor. Her hands were stiff from gripping the chair's edge all night, her muscles sore from tension. She didn't move until the first beams of sunlight illuminated the creature's face. A deep shudder passed through her. The wound she had inflicted, splintered wood embedded deep in its skull, was leaking something thick and dark. But what made her stomach twist in revulsion was the way the liquid moved. It wasn't pooling like blood. It was slithering, pulling itself toward the doorway, inching across the floor like it had a mind of its own. Bryn scrambled back, heart hammering against her ribs. The liquid reached the threshold of her house and seeped outside, stretching in unnatural tendrils toward the burnt circle on her lawn. She didn't want to know what that meant. Moving quickly now, she grabbed the nearest dish towel and threw it over the alien's face. She couldn't look at it anymore. Taking shaky breaths, she went for the phone again, clinging to the last shred of hope that help was still an option. No dial tone. Her gaze flickered to the light switch. She flipped it once, twice. Nothing. Bryn bit her lip, turning to her kitchen window. Everything inside her screamed that she shouldn't step outside, but she had to. She needed to see how far this had spread. Slowly, she cracked the door open. The air was heavy, charged, like it had been right before the electronics went haywire the night before. But more than that, everything was eerily quiet. Then she saw her car. It wouldn't start. She knew it before she even tried. The hood was slightly ajar, the engine cover peeled back unnaturally, as if something had pried it open from the inside. Bryn's breath quickened. She was stranded. She rushed back inside, heading straight for the bathroom. She washed her face, cleaned the gash on her forehead from when the alien had thrown her against the door, and pulled on a clean sweatshirt. Then she grabbed her bike from the garage. She was getting to town. The ride was faster than usual, her legs pumping furiously as she sped down the empty road. The deeper she got into the neighborhood, the more dread coiled in her stomach. The mailman's truck lay overturned in a ditch, its windshield shattered. Front doors to houses hung open, windows smashed. The lawns, every single one, were marked with the same scorched circles she had seen on her own grass. Bryn swallowed hard and forced herself to pedal faster. By the time she reached the police station, she felt like she was on the edge of a full-blown panic attack. The station was supposed to be a safe place, but when she pushed through the doors, the first people she saw were the last ones she wanted to. Ma's parents. She froze, breath catching in her throat. Mrs. Collins turned first. Her eyes darkened instantly, lips curling in disgust. Then, before Bryn could react, she spit at her feet. "You don't get to come here," she hissed. Bryn took a step back, but Mr. Collins, the chief of police, just stared at her with cold indifference. He didn't say a word, didn't even acknowledge her as someone in need of help. Something in Bryn cracked. She turned and bolted. Outside, her chest heaved, her breath coming in ragged gasps. There was no help coming. The town had already turned against her long before the aliens ever arrived. Bryn spotted a bus pulling up near the gas station across the street. Her hands clenched into fists. She could leave. Just go. She ran toward the bus, fumbling for her wallet as she reached the driver. He barely glanced at her before she shoved a few crumpled bills into his hand and took a seat near the middle. The engine roared to life, and Bryn dared to let out a breath of relief. But then something shifted. A noise, low and guttural, came from the man sitting in front of her. Bryn's eyes flickered to his reflection in the window. He was clicking, just like the thing in her house. Her stomach twisted as she saw the unnatural way his throat bulged, something writhing just beneath the skin. Then the woman beside him turned, her lips curling back in a wide, grotesque grin. Bryn barely had time to react before the man lunged at her. She kicked out, shoving him back into the aisle. His body convulsed, his mouth stretching open far too wide as something inside him pushed against the roof of his mouth. Screams erupted as another passenger, then another, began clicking, their bodies jerking unnaturally. Bryn didn't think. She acted. She grabbed the nearest bag and swung it at the possessed man, then shoved past the woman blocking the aisle, ignoring the way her fingers clawed at Bryn's arm. She threw herself toward the doors just as the driver swerved violently, trying to keep control of the bus as the possessed passengers flailed and shrieked. Bryn hit the emergency release on the doors. Then she ran. The possessed followed. Their movements were disjointed, human bodies puppeteered by something inside them. Bryn tore down the street, her lungs burning as she bolted for the one place that had always been a twisted form of comfort, the graveyard. She nearly collapsed when she reached Ma's grave, chest heaving. But when she looked down, the name on the stone made something inside her twist painfully. Ma Collins. It had always been here, the truth she had tried to bury with letters and guilt. She hadn't been writing to Ma. She had been writing to her ghost. Bryn barely had time to process the realization before something else caught her attention. The sky. A storm was brewing, except it wasn't a storm. It was something else. A pulsing, swirling mass of darkness moving toward the town. Then she saw the people, her neighbors, the townspeople, standing in perfect rows, their hands raised to the sky, their mouths hung open, their throats bulged. Bryn backed away, hands clenching into fists. She was alone. No one was coming to save her. And if that was the case, she would save herself. She took a deep breath, then another, and then she turned on her heel and ran back home. If they wanted her, they were going to have to fight for her, because she was going to home alone this nightmare. Bryn stood in the wreckage of her home, breathless, her body trembling from exhaustion. The air around her was thick with smoke and the lingering scent of burning fuel from the explosion that had taken down the spider-like alien. She had won. She had killed it. But the victory felt hollow. The spaceship still hovered in the sky, its enormous shape blocking out the stars. The hum of its presence vibrated through her bones, reminding her that she had only delayed the inevitable. They weren't done with her yet. She locked herself in her bedroom, pressing her back against the door as she fought to steady her breathing. Her entire body ached from the fight, from the running, from the fear that had dug into her like a parasite of its own. Then the lock clicked. Bryn's blood ran cold. The door creaked open. Another alien stepped inside, moving with slow, deliberate curiosity. It didn't lunge for her. It didn't attack. Instead, it reached out, fingers twitching, tilting its head as it took in the room. Bryn gripped her last remaining weapon, her paper cutter, but the alien didn't even glance at it. Its hollow sockets focused on something else. The letters. Her letters to Ma. They were scattered across her desk, a lifetime of guilt poured into ink and paper. The alien reached out, its fingers barely brushing against them. The pages trembled, as if responding to its presence. Bryn took a step back, but before she could escape, an invisible force slammed into her. She was lifted off her feet, flung backward, and then the beam. It locked onto her, pressing her against the ceiling with an unrelenting grip. Bryn struggled, her arms pinned to her sides, her legs dangling uselessly. She tried to scream, but her throat tightened as if the air itself had turned against her. Then, from the alien's mouth, something wriggled. The parasite. It slithered free, curling and twisting as it drifted toward her, carried by an unseen force. Bryn thrashed, panic overtaking every rational thought. Her mouth was forced open, her jaw locked in place as the parasite crept closer, closer. Darkness. She woke up in her bed, drenched in sweat. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she sat up, her heart slamming against her ribs. Her room was fine, untouched. No wreckage, no blood, no signs of a struggle. Downstairs, she heard a familiar sound, footsteps. Slowly, hesitantly, she got out of bed and made her way down the hall. She rounded the corner into the kitchen and stopped dead in her tracks. Ma stood in front of the stove, her back turned. Bryn's entire body went rigid. "Ma?" Her voice came out small, barely a whisper. Ma turned. She was exactly as Bryn remembered. Warm brown eyes, a mischievous smirk tugging at her lips. "Hey, sleepyhead," she teased. "You gonna help me with breakfast or just stand there looking weird?" Bryn's chest tightened. This wasn't real. Her hands curled into fists at her sides as she took a slow, careful step forward. Ma looked so real. She sounded real. But Bryn knew the truth. She knew because Ma was dead. Tears burned in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry." Ma's expression flickered just for a second. Then she smiled, stepping closer. "It's okay," she whispered. Bryn shook her head. It's not, Her voice cracked. "I killed you." Ma's smile never wavered. Instead, she reached out and placed a hand against Bryn's cheek. "It was an accident," she said softly, "and it's time to let go." Bryn's breath hitched. Then she felt it. Something inside her throat. Her fingers twitched. Her body felt wrong, like she wasn't entirely herself. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she reached up, trembling fingers pressing against her neck. Something moved beneath her skin. No. Her nails dug into her throat, panic surging through her veins. She gagged, choked, clawing at her own skin until she felt something wet, something writhing. And then she pulled it out. A parasite, small and glistening, squirmed in her fingers. The second it was free, Bryn gasped. air rushing into her lungs, the haze in her mind clearing. Her vision snapped back to reality. She was standing in the wreckage of her home, the alien spaceship still looming above her. The parasite writhed in her grasp, trying to escape. The beam caught it. Bryn barely had time to react before the parasite was yanked upward, disappearing into the light. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled back, and then something was standing in front of her. Her own face, a doppelganger. The fake Bryn lunged, a jagged blade clutched in its fist. Pain exploded in her side. Bryn gasped, feeling the blade sink into her flesh. The doppelganger leaned in, its breath warm against her ear. "Stay here," it whispered. Bryn's vision blurred, but she wasn't done fighting. With the last of her strength, she reached for her paper cutter, her fingers closing around its handle. With a single desperate motion, she sliced the doppelganger's throat. The fake Bryn gurgled, stumbling back. Blood, if that's what it was, spilled from the wound, its eyes wide with shock. Then it collapsed. Bryn swayed on her feet, pressing a hand to her own wound. She didn't have time to rest. The beam found her again. This time she couldn't fight it. Her body lifted off the ground, pulled toward the ship. She didn't struggle. She didn't scream. She was too tired. Inside the ship, everything was white. Shapes moved around her, but she couldn't see them clearly. She felt something cold press against her forehead, and suddenly, memories. Ma laughing, Ma shouting, Ma pushing her, Bryn falling. The rock in her hands, the impact, the silence. Tears slipped down her face. Then something changed. She saw herself as a child, writing her first letter to Ma. She saw herself breaking again and again, reliving the same moment for years. Then, someone else appeared. Herself, but younger. The child, Bryn, looked up at her with wide, teary eyes. Bryn hesitated. Then she reached out, taking her younger self's hand. The weight lifted, the ship hummed, the lights shifted, and suddenly, she was on the ground again. The sky above her was painted with strange, swirling colors. The spaceship was leaving. Bryn lay in the road, staring up at the sky, a slow, tired smile curling at her lips. She was free. The next morning, the town felt different. People greeted her, smiled at her. The streets were lively, filled with laughter and conversation, but as she looked closer, she saw it. The way they all stood too straight, the way their throats moved just a little too much when they spoke, and above them, high in the sky, the ships lingered. Bryn smiled back at them. She wasn't sure if this was real, but maybe it didn't matter anymore.